You talk about that there must be the right infrastructure, the right feeding ground, that entities who have the responsibility of implementing industrial policy are doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Now, Singapore had Temasek and I think another entity. In the United Kingdom, you have the City of London Development Corp. You can argue whether or not they are successful, but at least they get a job done.
Yeah.
What are your ideas of creating and managing these type of entities?
Yeah.
Because I feel there is some sort of suspicion from certain parts in society. If you look at how Ronald Reagan tackled big government, what are your suggestions toward this issue? The second question is, what are your thoughts about using cost of capital? Should you not use it, or should you normalize cost of capital?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, different countries have implemented industrial policies through different types of agencies. Yeah? So in the case of Korea, which is probably the most extreme case, you had this agency called Economic Planning Board, which was a planning ministry, but very importantly, it also controlled government budget. So in other countries, even in Japan, there's always that the planning ministries, Ministry of Industry, they want to spend money. The Ministry of Finance doesn't want to. Yeah? But in the Korean case, the Ministry of Finance only collected taxes. They had to give it to the planning ministry. So the planning ministry had a free hand in deciding where the money goes. Yeah? That's an extreme example, but so that's one type of arrangement. In others, you had line ministries being in charge of industrial policy. So the famous MITI, Ministry of Industrial Trade and Industry in Japan, it was in charge of the industrial policy. In Taiwan, it was Industrial Development Board. So you could have a dedicated ministry for industrial policy. Third type is the state-owned holding companies like Temasek. Yeah? Temasek owns shares in all these state-owned companies, sometimes 100%, sometimes 25%. It's majority owned by the Singapore Ministry of Finance. So it is basically a government agency, but it's a bit removed from the Ministry of Politics. Yeah? That's another arrangement that you can have. So there's no one single way that works. I mean, different countries have had different arrangements. I mean, to stretch it a bit, you could even say that in the United States, the industrial policy was mainly done by the Pentagon, yeah? rather than Ministry of Commerce or these other places. So there's no one set formula. You will create an agency and do things according to your needs, your capabilities. Yeah? Now, then the question of finance. I think, one common misconception is that industrial policy is all about money. No, actually, a lot of policies that I've talked about is about coordination, about regulation, about making sure that there's no duplicative investment. Of course, it involves money in the sense that sometimes you are giving subsidies, sometimes you are setting up your state-owned enterprises, sometimes you are financing training programs. So I'm not saying that money is not important, but there are lots of industrial policy which is about coordination rather than money. So that's the first point. But secondly, insofar as that you need money, basically this means that you need to have certain financial channels that you can manipulate. Yeah? Because in France, in Korea, in Taiwan, between the 1950s and 80s, the majority of banks were owned by the government. In the case of Korea, all the banks. Yeah? In the case of Taiwan, most of the banks. In the case of France, many of the banks were owned by the government, so that they could use this as a tool for industrial policy. Many countries have set up special banks like development banks or banks for small and medium-sized enterprises to promote certain types of industries and enterprises. And yeah, I mean that you could also use the government bond market and international loans and many different forms of finance. But yes, I agree that even though it's not all about money, having control over certain financial institutions is very important because a lot of policies will involve money.
But if you would have used a normalized cost of capital for POSCO, you would struggle to justify POSCO.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So you are doing, what is known as well, implicitly social cost-benefit analysis. Yeah. So you are accepting that there are externalities. Yeah. You are accepting that there are public goods and so on, and you adjust the rate of return and the cost of capital according to that. So, I mean, yeah, I'm not saying that they necessarily did those the analysis, but especially in the early stages of development, even the very existence of the manufacturing itself can generate externality in the sense that in a country with predominantly the agrarian population, people do not even necessarily have the education and discipline needed to work in a factory. If you are working in your subsistence farm, you are the master of your own work. If you work in a factory, you have to be there at 8:45 so that everyone can start at the same time. You have to take the break at the same time. You need different kind of work discipline. Yeah? You could even argue that in countries with very small manufacturing sector, the very investment in whatever factory is going to create some externality in the sense that it's going to create a pool of the workers with modern labor discipline. Yeah? So you can take a lot of things into account, and I mean, many of these are kind of unquantifiable, so I don't think it's possible to come up with numbers, but I mean, at least at the conceptual level, you can adjust the cost of capital and rate of return according to these externalities and other factors that are not usually reflected in the market prices. Yeah?
I'd just like to ask you to maybe elaborate on a country that's popped up a couple of times in here, but you haven't gone into in depth, which is Brazil.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at some point that Brazil pretty much destroyed its manufacturing base. However, the Brazilian, if I'm correct, Brazilian National Development Bank is one of the largest, wealthiest banks in existence.
Exactly.
So if you have such a large store of wealth for sort of investment in industrial use in industrial policy, how particularly did Brazil's manufacturing base become destroyed?
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunate thing is that since the mid-1990s, Brazil had this very restrictive macroeconomic policies. Yeah? So basically, the picture was that however large BNDES was, it couldn't finance everything. Yeah? So a limited range of industries that could get financing from the BNDES were okay because they were paying 5%, 6% rather than 12%. Yeah? But if you fall outside that, you had it. Yeah? Basically, since the 1990s, it was more like used as a damage control device because this restrictive macroeconomic policy was playing such havoc with the manufacturing sector by raising real interest rates, by overvaluing the currency. Only a limited range of companies who could somehow convince BNDES to finance them could survive, and all the rest were just devastated. Yeah.
So talking about or looking at China, a large chunk of, well, not a large, but a proportion of their industrial policy seems to be quite external, like putting money into Africa through loans for their infrastructure development. I just wondered if you could maybe talk a bit about that and the effects that it could have on Africa as a continent, being reliant on these loans, and the benefits, I guess, that China will.
China, I mean, at one level has been pursuing policies similar to that of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, but it is in many other ways very different. because it has geopolitical ambition. Yeah? So a lot of things that it does is not purely driven by economic calculations, but it's a wish to kind of take a place in the global geopolitics. So you cannot understand what China does entirely on the basis of economic calculations. Also, secondly, it has industrialized in an era of more open global finance. So unlike the Japanese or the Korean companies, from very early on, you could actually buy up companies in foreign countries to absorb technology. So that's another important difference. Because yes, I mean, Korean companies have more recently bought American companies, European companies, and so on. But I mean, they couldn't do it when they were at, Korea was at China's level of development, because that was back in the 1980s when global financial markets were not that open. Yeah? So there are these important differences, but yeah, insofar as more specific industrial policy issues are concerned, China has started branching out into, I mean, especially Ethiopia, but some other low-wage countries, also in Asia, in recognition that its wages have been rising. Yeah? And it's basically shifting all these low skilled, low-wage jobs like garments and so on to low-wage countries. So its expansion into Africa, first of all, is driven by that, but more importantly, is driven by its wish to have access to critical natural resources. And yeah, in that is kind of really building is the geopolitical network, the recent One Belt, One Road initiative, and various schemes to provide foreign aid to poor countries in Africa. Yeah, once again, I mean, countries like Korea were not giving foreign aid when they had $8,000 per capita income. Yeah? But China is doing it much more early. Yeah? Now, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think for the moment it's a good thing, because so far global development finance had been basically monopolized by the World Bank and the IMF. Yeah? So basically there was only one bank in town. Yeah? You basically either don't get any money or you have to follow what they are suggesting. Now with China as a potential funder, you have a bit of bargaining power as a developing country, because you can always credibly say that, well, if you don't give us better terms, we are going to go and talk to the Chinese. But in the long run, when China reaches a more kind of dominant position, is it going to be as positive? As a good Korean whose country has been bullied by all the big neighbors for the last 5,000 years, I'm always skeptical if someone becomes too strong. So, I mean, so in the long run, it could be very negative. And there are already some countries where there's so much Chinese investment and influence that it is becoming a problem. But I think on balance, at the moment, it's a positive thing. But yeah, in the future, it could be very different.
So broadening out to the whole BRICS selection, I mean, do you see, no one's got a crystal ball, but what do you see for the future, the next 20 years or so, with regards to the BRICS becoming economic powerhouses and their threat to US hegemony? And
yeah, well, first of all, BRICS, I don't think it's a very meaningful category. I mean, it was something invented by a banker, catchy, but at some very vague level, these are big countries that are becoming more important, coming out of the non-Western world. So yeah, they have some commonality, but I don't know whether that you can put Russia and Brazil, not to speak of Russia and China, in the same basket, because Russia is basically an economy based on extractive industries, whereas China is industrializing like mad, and Brazil, despite all this deindustrialization is a country with serious manufacturing capabilities. And also, is there any kind of political kind of common understanding between these countries? I don't think so. So I'm skeptical of that category. But another point is that you have to realize that Russia, India, Brazil, they are still very small. I mean, China is now 15, 17, 20% of world economy, depending on exactly what numbers you look at. But the other countries, they barely account for 2% of the world GDP. So they are not even near China in terms of their influence. So I think that category is a bit problematic. But yes, I mean, it is true that in relative terms, the influence of the old core capitalist countries in Western Europe and North America is declining. So we need to come up with international arrangement that reflects that fact. I mean, especially in the World Bank and the IMF, the voting shares, which are essentially based on the share capital contribution of different countries, they basically reflect the distribution of economic power at the end of the Second World War. So it means that smaller European countries are massively overrepresented. And even though there have been some adjustment, giving a bit more vote to China, a bit more vote to Korea, it isn't even near what the reality is. So yes, I mean, in that sense, the rise of the South, so to speak, has to be accommodated. But I don't know whether we should understand it as the so-called BRICS issue.